Welcome to Getting Rich Together, the show for successful women who are looking to take their financial futures to the next level. I'm your host, Shama Bunton. When I started my wealth building journey, nobody knocked on my door to give me all the answers. So I want to talk to the experts who've done it and bring the answers to you so we can discover the right opportunities that will help us achieve the financial futures we've always dreamed of, together, and have fun doing it. So let's dive into this episode and start getting rich together. I am here today with the incredible Vanessa Cartwright. Vanessa, most people know you as leading up agencies and being in the C-suite roles of so many incredible companies and really shaping brands and narrative in the most magical ways. And while today we will eventually get to all of your incredible expertise and all the things you're known for your contributions in the world, I'm so excited to unpack the other parts of your life, the things that really make you unique in who you are. So Vanessa, welcome to Getting Rich Together. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much for having me here.
Absolutely. While most people can't see you on camera, since we don't video record, I have to say I love your glasses. And you guys, Vanessa is just extremely stylish. I'm always pleased when I get to see someone on the show who looks so fabulous. So thanks for bringing it, even though we're not on video.
All right. Well, thank you. I will say I have some fabulous bright green pants on. If only you could see those two.
So Vanessa, let's start from when you were a little girl. Take me back to a young Vanessa, maybe someone between 7 and 12 years old. Where on earth were you in this beautiful world of ours? What were your parents like? What were you doing? And what was money like as a little girl?
All right. So around about then, we had just moved. We lived in Suffolk in the UK. I had a younger sister, and my family and I moved out into essentially the middle of absolutely nowhere, into a field, I call it, in Suffolk, which is where we stayed and I was raised. Very rural type of childhood. We had moved there. I thought we had moved there from my parents to give us a wonderfully idyllic countryside childhood. But later, just a few years ago, in fact, discovered really we went there because there were wide open spaces. And my father, who was a radio telecoms research scientist, could mount huge, big radio masts without interference because there was nothing else around there. So that's actually why we went.
That's so cool.
Yeah. It was funny. And so for the first few years of being there, my father was working, as I said. That's why we were in Suffolk in the first place. That's where the big British Telecom research labs were. And my mother, really, who does everything in an extremely wholehearted way, decided to go whole hog into countryside life. So we had goats, we had hens and chickens, we had puppies and cats. She learned to cane chairs and make curtains in the orchard after school. And it was all, she went full on in making sure that we had, the proper quintessential British countryside childhood.
Wow. And so when you were that age, what did you think you wanted to be when you grew up? I mean, what an interesting sort of life experience to get to be in the country and get to experience sort of life in this very idyllic way.
I went through all the typical, I wanted to be a ballet dancer. I wanted to be a show jumper. I wanted to be a pianist. I wanted to be a novelist. As it turns out, I've really not become, of course, any of those things, but those were very much sort of on top of my mind. I was a very studious child, I would say, and I liked nothing much more than, I wasn't out trying to find a pony somewhere to ride. I was gathering together everybody's library cards so I could get the maximum number of books out of the local library, and I would sit at the top of the stairs and read my way through all of them, and much to the great displeasure of my sister, who claims I never played with her because I was always reading.
I always feel like one of the biggest things when we were little was you have to return the library book. And, exactly. the fees that would rack up, or the shame of sort of having a book in your room for too long. Did you ever miss a return date, Vanessa, with your library book?
Oh, I am sure I did not know.
Oh my God, that's so funny. And so as you were starting to develop and mature more into yourself in high school, what were you interested in? Were you sort of thinking about, okay, we're in the country, was there any such thing as a part-time job that you would have gotten at that time? Was it really heads down with your girlfriends? Like, what was life like for you? And how did you start to think about, developing into your young self?
Yeah. And you'd also asked a little bit about money and how the sort of that had worked as a child as well. And my mother didn't work for the first few years. She did gradually start to, I would say there's a pretty strong, just general work ethic in our family in a whole. So I always assumed I would have a proper career. But as you point out, in sort of the early days in Suffolk, there's not very much. So the list of random jobs my sister and I both had, and I've been working pretty much nonstop since I was 14 years old, began at a tea room in a garden center. We worked in packing warehouses. I worked behind bars. I actually really like working behind a bar. I always say that's my fallback. Yeah. So very much, both my sister and I always worked. We always worked, looked after by our parents, of course, but I think both of us, anything that was, extra, and the independence that we wanted to go and be able to buy our own clothes and do our own thing, that was very much, what we needed to step up and do.
I love that. It's, I feel like those first few tastes of independence can really set you up for specific outcomes in your life, right? It's like with a willingness to take the job or do the thing or get scrappy and, figure things out in order to have what you wanted in life. And so were there any special high school purchases that really stick into your mind that you did with any of your spending money?
I spent a lot of it on records back in the day. Well, people buy records again now. So there's an awful lot of David Bowie records that have traveled with me from Suffolk to Vancouver to New York to back to Suffolk. The first time I got a job actually in an office, and I definitely remember going out and buying a very beautiful shirt. You pointed out the kind of clothes. I do like clothes. I remember doing that right at the very beginning. And what I very much wanted was a pony, which I never actually achieved that goal, but I did manage to assemble a fairly complete grooming kit and all manner of things for my fictitious pony.
I love that so much. So as you were sort of then deciding to go into university and, time was ready for you to start to, move to this next step of evolution of self, at that point, what was clear to you? What did you sort of know about yourself as you were entering into this university phase?
That's a great question. I've never been asked it exactly like that. I think what I quickly learned was that I'm quite able to sort of raise my hand for something that is difficult and new. So I started university to read English and French, and I fairly quickly realized I got a chance to do a foundation year, which is more similar to the way that the US colleges work. So a range of different things. And one of the topics I studied during that first year was Russian politics at the time. And I decided that I would switch from my French major. I was like, I know how to read and approximately speak French. What I'll actually do is I'll take on something that's quite difficult that I've never done before and do a Russian degree. So I ended up doing a joint honors English and Russian degree. And I also added in a bit of math. I haven't done as well in math in my final year at high school as I'd wanted. So I was like, all right, I'm going to not let that fail me. I'm going to go back and have another go. So that's probably one of the things that I learned. And I fairly quickly solidified that when we had to go spend some time in Russia. And they said, well, you could do 3 weeks, which would be a nice little easy, almost a holiday, or we've got this whole brand new exchange program and you can go for 3-4 months to somewhere that we've never really had a relationship with before as a university and trial out this program. So I was like, oh, that sounds really hard. I should probably go and do that.
Oh my gosh. Wow. So you spent a few months living in Russia as you were working on wow, that is so incredible. What were some of the moments of that trip or that experience that really stuck with you?
I mean, I think assuming you want things a little bit related back to the topic of wealth, and I was in Russia in what was that? It was sort of the late 1980s. It was the final year of Gorbachev. It was the last year of sort of glasnost before Yeltsin came in, and I think previously had a fairly rose-tinted view of what that society was like. To arrive and find that there was extreme poverty, there was extreme lack of goods to purchase. I think kind of interesting now, given some of the kind of current tariff situations and conversations that are happening, but there was almost nothing. And there were an awful lot of people employed to do things that look fairly pointless, a lot of endless sweeping for no good. So it was an interesting eye-opener into that particular system. And I think did teach me that maybe that wasn't exactly the political system that I would necessarily support. And I also discovered that the dollar, because we took dollars with us, went an incredibly long way, and we ended up spending a lot of time. We very specifically decided that we would not spend our money in any, you could go and use your foreign currency in particular stores, and we decided that we wouldn't do that. We were going to live like Russians, and we would only buy what Russian people were able to buy, which ended up, and for some reason, the only stores that had very much in them were hat stores. So we got quite a lot of hats. I can't explain why that's the case, but it was. I got quite a number of different Russian hats and a big abacus and all sorts of things. But we were fairly strict about our policy of only buying whatever food Russian people could buy or whatever supplies and goods that they could access.
It's such a self-aware perspective as a young person to be traveling to a new place and sort of this agreement with oneself that I will take on the culture and as much as one might be able to sort of really expose yourself to what life is like there. And also as a young person then returning back to the United States, returning back to England, it's like a very different contrast. And then also in terms of exposure and really now it sounds like your life is starting to really compound with experience, right? And it's like your purview and things are really opening up in terms of what things were like. So by the time you graduated from university, what did you then know of yourself? Were you, all right, I've amassed these degrees and now I know I want to go into advertising and I want to go into agency work and I want to build brands and I want to sort of shape narratives. What did you sort of know you wanted to do at that time?
I knew where I wanted to do it. I knew I wanted to go to London. I needed to get out of the fields and properly into London. So that was one thing. There were a range of different things that I looked into, advertising being one of them. But in actual fact, I found my way into that world almost not by accident, but I suppose more kind of laterally. So I actually ended up, since my primary purpose was to start working as opposed to wait for the perfect thing, I was very fortunate and got a job working for a small, quite well-known educational publishers just as an assistant. Did that for a little while, then moved to a much bigger publishing company and took a maternity cover role there, which was fantastic. And I'll name drop a little bit, but I met authors like Joseph Heller. I still have a signed copy of Catch 22 that I'm afraid I haven't actually read. But it was, a wonderful experience. Then I moved to a company called Book Club Associates, which people who are probably older than you in the US would know about because they ran the sort of double-day book clubs that were very popular in the sort of 90s or so. And that was a great grounding. And that's sort of where I transitioned away from strict publishing, although I had a really fun time dealing with a lot of authors, being responsible for determining how many copies of the new Stephen King book we would buy, all those things. It was really a very fun time. And I'm actually still in touch with lots of the people that I worked with from then. But that really, I moved away from the more publishing, kind of assessing the book side of things, because I felt it was from the little girl who'd sat and read 16 books over a weekend in Suffolk. I was then actually having to take big manuscripts home with me each day and read them. And I felt that it was starting to not spoil my love of reading, but turning it into a profession was impinging on it in some form. So I transitioned across into their marketing department, which is where I guess that's the beginning of the sort of marketing and
I love that
advertising story.
So in these early days, obviously, I feel like the publishing industry has changed so much today and is probably unrecognizable, I imagine, in some capacities, and then in other ways, probably very much the same. But early on in your career, as you were sort of advancing, did you find yourself being a self-advocate for, getting raises or promotions, or what it looked like as you were starting to build your career? Was it really, let me just get in here and get the experience and sort of focus on that component?
So I was fortunate that I was selected. I don't know that I put my hand up for it, but it was an internal graduate training program in that company. And that, I think, was one of the first times where I got the opportunity to realize that, I realized that they were looking for their future leaders. And I hadn't ever really thought about my career in that way. But once I was selected to do that, and we had to, present to the managing director of the company, recommendations, we were owned by Bertelsmann, a big German group, and we got access to those people. And I think at that point, I realized that this was, a career that I could manage and I could sort of self-direct myself a little bit more proactively. So for me, it was less about the financial part. It was much more about access to decision making and being given responsibility and being in the sort of the rooms where interesting conversations were happening. So I did proactively, I'd been in that company for about 5 years and decided that it was time for me to kind of move over to the agency side of the world. Was very fortunate, got a great position at one of the big holding company agencies in London at the time, which was excellent for my career, and I think really set me up for the rest of what I subsequently did. But I remember in there, and I'm still very closely in touch with both of my direct managers from both of those companies. I see them fairly often. I was actually writing with one of them just earlier today. But I remember saying to her, and I'll point out that this woman who hired me at the agency was female, and there was a female managing director. But I remember saying to her, I just want to be in the room. I'm just curious. I want to know where the conversations are happening, and I'd like to be part of them. So I think more than the financial part was obviously important, but for me, I think the driver was very much being in those interesting conversations where decisions were happening.
I love that. And so your curiosity to sort of see who's making what decisions, how people are thinking. Do I feel like there's nothing quite like being a great listener, right? Because it really gives you the opportunity to make strategic decisions. As you were sort of advancing in your career and hearing and picking up different things, what were the things that you sort of heard around you that maybe started to inform not just your professional life, but some of your more personal decisions, whether that was, oh, I'm going to switch jobs now, or I'm going to maybe start looking at investing or buying your first property or saving. Being able to be a great listener, I feel really just can reap so many rewards when you're curious and when you're willing to sort of hear what's going on around you.
Yeah, I think less directly in terms of investing and hearing much about that. I think that it was something that sort of you knew you needed to get onto, but I think still at that point felt like I would get there. And I was fortunate in the first role that there was some form of company pension, which I still have tucked away in the UK somewhere.
That's amazing.
Yeah. No, I didn't think the company actually went bankrupt, and I thought that it had disappeared. And several years ago, I decided to go on a little bit of a treasure hunt and see if there was anything there, and there wasn't, enough. So that was quite a worthwhile exercise. I think property has probably been for me one of the interesting parts of where I've been able to use my money or my financial health, perhaps. So I did buy a property with a partner quite young. I think it's perhaps more common in the UK than it used to be anyway, than it is in the US. So I think I was about 26 when I bought my first house, and that very then naturally enabled me to buy the next house. I then moved to Vancouver with my, at the time, husband, and really enabled us to then get on that sort of property ladder there, because each time you'd make that transition, we did well out of every one of those different places. So then you just step up and step up. So suddenly the sort of traditional approach to the property ladder, which I know may be harder for people now, particularly with different interest rates and different requirements for deposits and things, but that certainly helped me build, my own financial future.
I think that's so incredible, this foresight or opportunity to do so at a young age. You're absolutely right. I think it's really challenging for most folks today. If someone who was young was listening, they'd be like, Vanessa, how can I do this?
I know.
How do I sort of make that work? What's the way to sort of make all these leaps? And so from the standpoint, you started to mention, moving around. And so this decision to move to Vancouver and then subsequently to move and spend time in New York, how did you sort of manage these big life decisions? Was it, I have the job security waiting for me here? Or was it, I really want to move to Vancouver and sort of here's how we sort of established ourselves? How did you start to think about some of these bigger moves and changes?
Yeah, well, I think they're all terrifying. I also, in a sort of back to front way, my first visit to New York is what kind of gave me the impetus to move to Vancouver. We'd been planning it. I was very nervous about going to Vancouver. I didn't think I had the ability to do it, if I'm honest. I knew that I could. I knew I'd get the points to get permanent residency and all the things, but it just seemed very overwhelming. And I went for a weekend with a friend of mine to New York, and I was like, this is super exciting. And for some reason, just knowing that going somewhere new could feel that exciting kind of gave me the push to think, let's give Vancouver a shot, and the courage to do it. And I think, from a stability perspective, I did not have a job there. Neither my husband or I did, but I did have a tremendous amount of faith that the experiences that I'd got from my career were robust enough. And they were from London, from pretty well established businesses that had a good name recognition and reputation, that it would work, that it would ultimately work out. I met you. I like networking. I like getting to know new people. I did that. I sort of laid the groundwork before I went. I reached out to people. I built connections. Again, people that I met at that point, I'm still connected with. They're still part of my network. And within 4 or 5 weeks of landing in Vancouver, one of the agencies that I'd met with in that sort of exploratory process offered me a job.
That's amazing. And so then the decision, then it was like, all right, we're going to balance our savings or sort of go into it knowing that this is going to work out. And we don't know when or how, but we know it's going to happen. And, sort of continuing down this path of faith, which I think is so valuable and so important. Faith in the interviews that I've had with so many women, this concept of going for it and doubling down on oneself and taking risk and having faith tends to be a really consistent theme. This idea that there is some sort of inner calling or voice or something that's telling you to go down a path, and you may not know what it yields. And all of a sudden you find yourself having the thing that you wanted and not necessarily knowing how. So during your time in Vancouver, you were there, I think, for almost, was it nearly 10 years? You spent your time out there. Were you sort of then, and from a financial standpoint, obviously you had this pension with the firms in England, was it similarly set up in Vancouver? Were you holding sort of pensions now in different countries? How did you kind of navigate the financial systems there?
Yeah, well, I will say we made a poor decision at the beginning and invested in a biotech funds with some of our money from our house, and that didn't go very well. So let's be clear, not everything works out very well. But, I just began to just really slowly, I think I began a college fund for my daughter as soon as she was born. So she was born a year or two after we got there. And I began to put money in Canada in my RRSP. So very similar process to in the US with a 401k. So nothing dramatic, just really kind of slow and but fairly steady. And so, that still is there as something that's not massive, but will be part of the bigger portfolio of hopefully what will support me going forward.
Of course. And then also thinking of then coming up on your move to New York, I think what's interesting is as our financial lives and as our lives become more evolved and just we're living longer and we have different experiences, our taxes certainly don't get any easier. And all of a sudden, you're now dealing with a far more complex financial life. Before you decided to make the decision to move to New York, before that happened, who was sort of on your bench? How did you sort of make sense of it all?
Well, at that time, things were fairly straightforward. I hadn't rediscovered my little pot of money in the UK at that point. We ended up having a tax accountant to help us manage the move because there were a number of years. We had a house that we had bought in North Vancouver that we rented out. We pretty quickly had to take on the process of doing a tax filing. I'd always done our taxes for both my husband and I in Canada by myself. But once we moved to the US, I was like, all right, now that's too much. Like managing that whole process and figuring out how to move things across, that was all quite complicated. So we had a tax accountant through that process. And I've continued to have a different one, but a tax accountant to help me in the US for sure.
I'm often hearing folks saying, I want to live in this other country. I want to pick up and move. And that sounds great. And there are things that come along with that, that we have to.
Yeah, there certainly are. I'm not wanting to jump in the story too far forward, but as you know, right now, I'm spending more of my time in the UK than in the US, but I am a citizen of the US. So I have citizenships from the UK, Canada, and the US. So I am bracing myself with some complexity. I've spoken with some both financial advisors and tax accountants because whether it's like big or small, there's complexity with needing to file in all those different places.
Sure. Wow. Okay. So what were the dominoes that fell that took you from Vancouver to New York? How did you end up in New York City?
first company that I had worked for had got acquired. I ended up leading it, and that just in terms of my kind of financial journey, I suppose was quite helpful because each time there's been a ownership change of a company that I've been at, I was very fortunate that the founder of that company recognized her leadership team. And so that was probably helpful in that first house purchase in Vancouver. But I moved to a different agency. I wanted to broaden my experience. I wanted to go to a larger company that was a digitally native agency. And they essentially, when I joined, said, well, this is great. Are you mobile? And by that point, I'd had 2 children. We'd been in Vancouver for, as you say, nearly a decade. And I was like, you know what? Yes, I think we're mobile. And they said, well, I think there's an opportunity either in San Francisco or in New York. Would you be open to either of those? And I was like, well, I feel like not that I've done the West Coast. Obviously, it's a it's a very large territory, but I felt like New York would take me a little bit closer to London. I feel like it's the natural counterpart to London in many ways. So I pumped for New York. So that's where we ended up in 2008.
Oh, wow. And so did you guys then sell your properties in Canada? Or like, we're going to keep those and then we're going to establish ourselves in New York in a different fashion?
So initially we kept the property in Vancouver. So the long-term plan at that point and I was married was that we would purchase a house in New York, in the New York area, but that we would keep the Vancouver house. And Vancouver house prices were already going up. They were projected to continue to go up. And we're like, that will be our pension. We won't have to worry about anything else. And we'll have a house and everything will work out perfectly. What you don't always foresee are the things that don't work out perfectly, because a year or two after that, we were divorced, had to sell the house to make all of that work out. So that particular part of the financial plan didn't work. And I don't know if you've touched on the topic of divorce in any of your previous conversations, but quite apart from the sort of, emotional difficulties of that, the financial impact is pretty substantial.
Please share more, if you will, Vanessa. When it comes to sort of thinking about, personally, I've spoken mostly about my own divorce and, what those implications were for me and sort of the journey that it started. But as you went through your divorce, what were some of the things that you maybe would have done differently, or things you learned about yourself? And really when it comes to the money component, because I think that most women don't think about their finances until there's a big life-changing event that happens. And then it goes, oh my gosh, now I need to think about all these different things, or it needs to look a different way, or now I'm on my own and, I have to sort of put on a different lens. What was that experience like for you from that perspective?
Just going back a little into my childhood, my parents got divorced when I was in my early 20s. And my mother, who had been working for a while, but had suddenly stepped away from a big career, did say to me at that point, just remember to always have your own financial independence, which doesn't mean that I had my own finances and my own sort of separate funds, but it meant that I knew I could be financially independent. I had the ability to support myself. So that had always been something that I kind of held quite close to me, just having my mother's experience. And she suddenly didn't end up destitute either, but she just felt that was really important. So one of the things, and again, without any sort of judgment in any direction, I had been the primary earner. And then for the last number of years before our divorce, I was the sole income generator, which was maybe not perhaps as mutual a decision. And so that was difficult going through a divorce. So anyway, we eventually reached resolution around that. And one of the things that I realized that I was fearful of was I didn't want to end up supporting somebody else. So what I did end up essentially was sort of trading off that for being the sole support for my children. Then I realized I needed to get pretty serious about saving, not just supporting them day to day, but saving for their education, since by that point we were living in the US and it seemed likely that that's where they would go to college. And I remember early on somebody telling me how much that cost, and I was like, absolutely got to be joking. That can't be possible. It is indeed possible. That then became something that I got and took quite a lot more seriously.
Wow. And so then in your career, at what stage in your career was this sort of top of mind for you? And did that sort of inform, I guess, any future decisions, right? All of a sudden life is changing, all this new responsibility. You're still obviously a powerhouse at work and, driving things and making things happen. But what decisions sort of did you start to make a little bit differently, and how did that inform some of the things you were doing?
So I suppose a couple of things. Firstly, was just a kind of pragmatic, if I got a bonus or I got commission or I got a bit of an earnout, I would put that away as opposed to spend it. I did buy a little art, but outside of that, I just was like, that has to go into essentially into their college fund. I've not ever had significantly expensive cars. It just kind of, I suppose, influenced the choices that I was making around anything that was a sort of a disposable part. And so that was part of it. The other part was I was able to, I had a small amount of money that I felt was enough to buy a second property, which I did for two reasons. One, or maybe even three. The first one was more of an emotional reason for me, that I wanted to have something that was entirely mine, not from I needed to own something, but just I needed to do it by myself. That was important to me after my divorce, that it wasn't something that we'd done together. It was something that was, all of my own. I also wanted something that would be a sort of, I suppose, a safe haven for my children and a place that could be multi-generational, that they could then use for their children. So when I think about sort of legacy, that's important to me, that I can maintain that property and have that for them, for their childhood, to have a consistent place, but also hopefully their children's childhoods as well. And then it also was a source of income. So I wanted to make sure that whatever I did there could be as independent financially as possible, so that it wasn't, an ongoing drain on me. So I actually fairly quickly after purchasing that second property established it as a Airbnb vacation rental as well. So now it serves all those purposes. We get to use it as a family. It generates enough income to essentially cover its cost-ish. And it's something that I hope we'll be able to kind of enjoy and maintain for at least one more generation.
I love that. How long have you had that property for now, the Airbnb?
9 years.
Wow, that is so exciting. I feel like most people are like, I really want to do an Airbnb, and they don't necessarily have the understanding of all that it takes. Can you double click a little bit into what it's been like to run and manage an Airbnb, and sort of, from the perspective of also balancing that with, the other work that you're doing, right? I think a big part of this is, how do we get creative with our financial life? And I'd love to hear a little bit more about your experience in running and managing an Airbnb while doing it all.
It goes in like peaks and valleys. And of course, I do it remotely, whether it's about 2 hours drive away from me when I'm in New York, and it's obviously many hours away from me when I'm in the UK. So I've also had to set up a kind of a network of people that can help me while I'm not there. So I have a fantastic housekeeper, cleaner. She has a great handy boyfriend that does things. I have a plumber that I've worked with for a long time. I have an electrician. I have a painter. I have a landscaper. I mean, that makes me sound like I employ a whole set of people. Like I don't, right? They come in, they do a job, they come out. They're not all on staff. But, it's having that network of people was really important. Someone who I know, and building and maintaining good relationships with them and treating them well is really important, because you have to rely on them a lot when you're running something like that and you're not right next door. I'm actually in an Airbnb in South Carolina right now, and I was talking to the owner of it this morning, because she lives in a second house on the property. And she's like, oh, it's so easy to have an Airbnb. I'm like, is it? Only if you live right next door. And I think there's a bit of an emotional toll as well, because it's, if you just set it up and run it as a business and you never use it as a home or a vacation property, I think that's one thing. But I do go there, I store a few things there, but I do keep it very much as an Airbnb. But it is also our family vacation property. And so if it ever is badly treated, or something goes wrong with it, or somebody complains,
It hurts
and criticizes, it hurts. So I have to spend quite a bit of time talking myself down from that and saying, it's actually a business. Like, think of it as a business. I just was out there for like 3 days, literally on my hands and knees, cleaning and cleaning. My daughter had been living there for a few months, and we just had to get the whole place completely spring cleaned, ready for the summer season. And so I'll get in there and do the actual work myself when I need to.
I love that. And so, Vanessa, coming off of the heels of holding C-suite roles and being in senior leadership, and then making this transition to sort of step away and move into this advisory consultant, capacity, that's a really big leap, right? It's like, especially when you come from having had so much power and control and the ability to run and manage teams and get things done. And all of a sudden, you're now finding yourself to be on your own and sort of really self-directed. How did you make the decision to transition out? Was it something that was a long time coming in your past previous roles where you knew this was going to be the next logical step? Did it come and sort of surprise you? What sort of happened?
I think I was increasingly feeling ready. I've been in the operator roles for now 25 years or so at fairly senior levels, managing director, chief operating officer, CEO a couple of times, president role. And on the one hand, there's a lot that comes with that. There's a lot of responsibility and there is a lot of decision making. There's also not as much decision making or autonomy as you think, because unless you're the actual founder and CEO of your own thing and you have no external investors, there's always someone. There's always an investor or a board director or a global CEO or someone. It's a difficult role balancing those things. And it's actually also it can be quite an isolating role because typically you don't really have peers in the organization, right? You lose your peer set. You might have really close friends and allies and colleagues or direct reports or right-hand people or whatever they might be, but you can't necessarily share everything with that role. So I'm just, side note, I'm just setting up a separate networking group called The Helm, which is like specifically for women going into a CEO or managing director role for the first time, because I think there's a support network that they need in a very particular way. To cut that sort of long story a bit shorter, I had the opportunity to kind of step back from my role. I was quite pleased to be able to do this. I also had a little bit of a runway with some time to think about it before there was a real financial imperative that I had to go into something else. I worked a little bit with an executive coach. I spent a lot of time in self-reflection. I also spent quite a lot of time sanding and scraping and varnishing wooden boats and all sorts of things, and decided that I would like a little more autonomy over my life and my sort of destiny. I'd also felt like I wanted more flexibility and to be able to choose to work with all sorts of different companies that I might not choose to work with if it was in a full-time capacity, but that I would work with in a part-time, fractional advisory kind of way, and that I could really accelerate learning. I think, full circle, we talked about kind of curiosity and learning. And I was like, oh, that means I'll get to learn about not just one company at any point in time, but maybe 3 or 4, and I don't have to commit to all of them, but I can get under the hood and I can understand them. And that way I'll accelerate my own learning. And particularly right now, where some of the companies, I'm advisor to an AI product startup. I've been coaching a CEO who's just founded an AI agency a little bit. Like, there's a lot of interesting stuff happening right now. So I can kind of access a lot of breadth in that world by working in this capacity, which I thought would be exciting as well. But it's incredibly nerve-wracking at the same time. And you made a point earlier about having that kind of faith in your own internal ability that it will ultimately work out. So I'm just working on that right now. Some days I have it and some days I don't.
I understand. It also is a lot to go from just, as you mentioned, you've been working since you were 14 and for, other people, right? And now essentially your career is really in your own hands. And one might beg to say that your career has always been in your own hands, but this feels, it's a little bit more different, right? It's less of a contractual employment or it's understanding I'll be solely dedicated to you for years. As you were sort of thinking about, and I know a lot of the women who listen to the show are in the midst of similar career transitions, successful careers in the corporate world, thinking about what does it look like to sort of have the confidence, but also the security to be able to start and maybe do something more fractional. How have you sort of navigated your own sense of self-security as you've been going through this transition?
I suppose I'm making adjustments to my own, essentially, if I think of myself as my own P&L, right? I have to fix the cost base, right? Because I don't know what the top line is going to be at this point. I can make projections, but I don't really know, and I've got no history. And I also want to simplify a little bit in my life as well. So what I decided to do was reconfigure my own sort of financial setup. So I'm selling the primary house that I have. which will just give me a little bit of flexibility. I don't necessarily need to do anything with that money, but it takes away the sort of relentless. When I realized that my property taxes were, anyway, that it's an expensive proposition owning a house in Westchester. So I was like, well, I don't actually have to, right? No one's making me continue doing that. I can release the kind of capital that I've built up in that, can do something else with it, but I can take away some of the financial pressure that wakes me up in the middle of the night by just taking out the biggest cost that I have. So, and I'm here in South Carolina for my daughter's graduation. So that's another one, hopefully off the table. And she and I are spending some time working on her own financial planning. Yeah. And it will be gradual, but we're going to start to work on, when does she take on different bills and start to do different things as well, so that she gets properly set up for how to manage, her own financial self going forward. The main thing is reconfiguring the cost basis.
It's literally, I think, the most overlooked and best thing about being an adult, which is that we get to change our mind. We get to say, that used to work for me. That was something I wanted. I don't want that anymore. This doesn't work for me anymore. I have new information. I get to change my mind and do things differently. And sometimes I would tell girlfriends, especially when it comes to the realm of dating, I'd say, would you take advice from an 18-year-old? And they're like, no. And I'm like, so then why are you living your life by the same rules that you did when you were 18? We get to evolve, and life gets to be what it is we want it to be in this particular moment. And so, Vanessa, as you're sort of thinking about legacy and you're thinking about impact in the world and what's left for you to accomplish and what you want to see, we are certainly living much longer these days than ever before, which means you have a lot of runway to go. It almost feels like you've freed yourself up of this previous life experience, and now you've codified it. And now it's like, it almost feels like this image of a free bird who's, what do I want? Where am I going? How am I going to create? Dare I say, it sounds like you're 21 all over again. So what is the legacy that you are wanting to create? What are you seeing and calling forward?
Great question. I talked a little bit about wanting to put something back to women in a similar situation that I've been in before. So I'm from small seeds, right? We'll see where that goes. But I think there are learnings and experiences that I've had and that other people have had that might be helpful. So I think there is a little bit of kind of putting back from a professional perspective. I think it's more in that area than in the sort of specific craft of digital or e-commerce or any of those things, although I, expect to continue advising in those areas. I think perhaps continuing the thread that maybe my mother started in me, which was just make sure that you're always financially able to be financially independent if you need to be. I think making sure that that is something that is certainly as a legacy for my children. And I don't mean just my daughter. I mean, both my daughter and my son. And so I think that my legacy is more in those areas than anything more tangible. I do feel that I'm at a point where I get to make some choices. I'm not quite sure what all of those choices will be. I've chosen to go and, live on a boat and buy a 100-year-old wooden sailboat, and who knows what I might choose to do next. I don't know. Maybe I'll move somewhere else. I suddenly thought I could choose to go and live in the UK for a bit, but still spend time here. And it all so far seems to be working.
I mean, so the buffet in front of you, Vanessa, it seems to be really abundant.
I'm not sure that I have yet crystallized this. There's no big legacy of I want to change a particular thing in the world. I think perhaps it's just to take those kind of attitudes and approaches to how you can kind of live a life with, you get to drive the purpose and make the decisions and create your own outcomes is, I think, perhaps the main thing I would want to have as a legacy.
That's beautiful. And so my last two questions are actually my two favorite questions. The first being, we talked a lot about buying homes, money through divorce, and just money in all these ways that are very serious. I would love to hear some of your most favorite purchases or things that you love to buy with your money.
Well, I've been really trying very hard not to spend very much money recently. I suppose I do have art that I like a lot. It's typically fairly sort of modern art. I was with my previous partner, worked in art for quite a long time, and sort of really made me look around at what I had and realize that I had things that were really quite boring and it could be much more fun. So I think that is when I've had the opportunity to say, just splurge on a thing that I find really fun. And I just recently moved into a new apartment and could put everything up on the walls again. And then you get to move it all around again. That's probably one piece on the sort of higher end of the scale. I think you can still, however, get just as much fun from going out and, buying a new lipstick or some beautiful, fabulous cheese.
Nothing quite like a fabulous cheese purchase. And may I say, can also be quite high end. The cost of cheese can really head up there. I mean, it's almost like buying maybe not fine jewelry, but maybe costume jewelry.
Yes. Yes, exactly. I agree.
And then my last question, Vanessa, is really around what we, the audience, can do for you. Sounds like you're in this incredible moment where you are taking on clients that you love, where you are calling in new experiences, new things. If you could ask us to support you and to provide you with anything, what is it that we can do for you?
If there's anyone that knows people who have founded small to medium-sized digital businesses, agencies or software businesses that need a bit of help figuring out what to do next, that's sort of my sweet spot, or equally looking to invest or acquire one of them and need a little bit of help to understand the landscape, to kind of dig into certain aspects of those businesses or make sure that they're successful and they get the value from their investment subsequently. That's my sort of sweet spot. Some love to have introductions or referrals there. But I think perhaps maybe more on an emotional level, the bit of stepping into something that's different and feeling the anxiety of that. So from anyone that's done that before and has found a way of making that work, I'd love to hear from you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here, Vanessa. What a fascinating life you've led, and also how much more interesting and fascinating things there are to come. I can't wait to pick up this conversation with you again and hear all that has transpired. Thank you for being here.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Getting Rich Together. Please take a minute to subscribe. And if you like this episode, I'd love it if you could share it with a friend who is ready to elevate their financial future. Until next time, let's keep getting rich together.